Alright YouTube, it's time for the Occult, video 96 on sacrifice, penance, things of that nature. I will say this. Most of the time Abrahamists, when they're more evangelical, you'd think of like the Bob Larsons of the Christian world, certain clerics of the Islamic world, some of the Orthodox Jews, when they criticize pagans or those who use magic that they happen not to agree with, they call it black magic, or they use the left-hand path. The sinister is a pejorative term as opposed to a proper label, which is what it is, denoting the feminine or Eastern style energies of the occult world. They typically regard pagans as a bunch of barbarians or occultists as a bunch of like blasphemers who are intrinsically concerned with sacrifice, not just animal sacrifice, but also especially of children and things of that nature. Now, if you look at Satanism, of course, it's not the case. In fact, the concept is frowned upon. It's actually a literal inversion of OT law, which is sacrifice-friendly. Not just sacrificing your enemies, no, but sacrificing animals ritualistically on a regular basis. This is still done within Islam. It's still done within Judaism. It's still done by a handful of Christians. Most Christians don't sacrifice animals these days. They've forsaken that as something that they're just not into it. They don't see a purpose behind it, even though they're technically violating their own Lord's commandments and their own doctrine by not doing so. Within Judaism, you had the practice of, for instance, ritualistically slaughtering cattle and then looking at their entrails to determine, like, how are the crops going to grow, how will the next war go. It's a very it's a Semitic tradition. It's very funny because it also was used by pagans in Greece at a time, by certainly the Romans, Egyptians to an extent, and yet they labeled the pagans as butcherists. My own thoughts on a personal level within my own path on sacrifice is that sacrifice is the opposite of the sort of thing that I want to be doing. I believe in self-gratification. I believe in pleasure. I believe in what some would term it hedonism. I don't, because the things that I take pleasure in, nature, being in silence, left alone, stuff like that, is more Epicurean. It's only a form of hedonism in that, coincidentally, it's Epicureanism in that coincidentally the things that I find enjoyable happen to overlap with the simple pleasures of Epicureanism, as opposed to, well, I arrived at that through some deeper philosophical goal. That's not entirely the case. Yes, I recognize it as morally perhaps superior, but it was coincidence largely, because those are simply the things that I'm interested in doing, and I only reflected upon that later. Sacrifice is spurned by Satanism. It's spurned by most Luciferian orders. Certain theistic, satanic groups certainly condone certain types of sacrifices. I've never seen children listed. The sort of animals that you would generally not eat aren't listed. They don't sacrifice cats and dogs and things like that. I find it additionally funny that many of the same Abrahamists who would frown upon animal sacrifice as being, oh, that's scary, it's evil or something. Well, I mean, they eat a hamburger, they'll still eat the pork chops or whatever. Maybe if they're like Jewish or Islamic, they probably don't eat the pork chops, but they killed the camel, they kill the goat or the sheep or whatever, and they eat them. I fail to see the difference, except that in one case you're gaining some sort of divine purpose behind it, and then usually consuming it anyway, as opposed to just sort of mindlessly consuming whatever sort of flesh happens to cross your path that isn't explicitly banned by your religion. On the topic of penance, I would say, why would you do anything you would feel sorry for? The best life you could lead is one in which you attempt at all times to remain conscious of your actions and of your thoughts, if applicable, I suppose. And you avoid that which would cause you to feel genuine and authentic guilt. Now, we have to differentiate between false guilt and the good guilt that keeps you on a straight and narrow path, not in the Christian sense, but whatever path you happen to be walking. If you are smart and you use reason, you will attempt to avoid those things. And you will also use your reason, if you're able to do so, to determine what is it that I should actually feel guilty for. Should I, for instance, should a person feel guilty for masturbating? No, because it's simply a sensual act. It harms nobody. There is no victim to it. The fact that it happens to be frowned upon or banned in some spiritual paths is just, it has to do with property, it has to do with child rearing. There was a real sense among some of these ancient people that if a person was masturbating, they were wasting their seed and they were depleting themselves and they would be less capable of having children or something of that nature. It was a flawed concept, but I guess I suppose it made sense to the people at the time. You can understand their reasoning without saying that, yeah, it actually was sensible and is true, because it's clearly not. They also thought sperm came from the kidneys, and they thought that children were literally, the woman was nothing more than an incubator. She didn't have any generative capabilities, only the man did. And in Eastern paths, and in some cases, the woman is the only one with the generative capability, and the man is just sort of borrowed energy or something like that. Among the Norse, they had perhaps the most wise concept, which was that they both were responsible in the generation. If the male was weak at the time, the child would look and act more like the mom, and vice versa, look and act more like the dad if he was stronger, she was weaker at the time. More of an enlightened, I think, look at it from the pagans of Scandinavia at the time than certainly any of the Abrahamists, most of the Easterners. I happen to think that the Scandinavian path is one of the wisest. You look at the Poetic Edda, you're getting a great deal of good information. The concept of penance, though, is useless to a person who actively seeks to avoid and does not believe in divine repercussions for an accidental transgression. Any behavior that would make them guilty, they would make them, think that they had done something specifically wrong. And I would say, you also have to be able to measure. I expunge and completely oppose the Christian notion that any one sin or wrongdoing is equal to another. Oh, well, the very idea that you would have sinned at all, it puts you in the same category with every other sinner. I think that's an abominable notion. I think that it's a great way to make axe murderers and rapists feel like they haven't done anything too much more wrong than stealing a stick of gum or something like that. I think you have to use reason to denote, for instance, was the victim killed? Was the victim physically harmed? Was it only psychological harm? Was there no direct harm done? For instance, it would be like the interplay of, if I steal a loaf of bread from a rich man, I've stolen something. If I've stolen $10 from a hobo down the street, I may have taken everything that hobo had. And the act is technically the same. Or let's make it even more similar. I steal $10 from somebody who only has $10 versus I steal $10 from someone who's a multi-billionaire. Which crime is worse? Absolutely speaking, the act is the same, the amount taken is the same, there's one victim in both cases. Maybe they're the same age, the same gender, they look almost identical. Everything being the same, though, me stealing from the rich man, the overall amount to which he is more diminutive in his wealth after being stolen from is considerably less than the other person, than the hobo or the bum or whatever I've stolen from. These two acts, I do not believe are identical because the outcome is completely different. The intent may be the same. The act itself, physically speaking, may be the same. So why would a person feel compelled to feel as sorry for the latter as the former? I think certainly we are psychologically ingrained. If you look at the way in which a person tends to react to violence against a child or a defenseless animal or like a woman or something, as opposed to two men, one of them slaughters the other in combat, there's a psychological and emotional difference that cannot be biologically overcome between these two acts. Yes, a human being has been killed or harmed or whatever. They're two totally different scenarios in every other possible respect. And I think one carries a greater burden of guilt than the other. I think that if two men are locked in combat and one accidentally kills the other, a lesser crime has been committed than if someone walks up to some kid, baseball bats him in the head, crushes their skull. Walks up and stabs somebody's kitten or something like that. Yes, I would say that those are greater crimes. Not for any naturistic sort of hippy-trippy nonsense, but because it is deeply psychologically ingrained. Their tales of this go back thousands and thousands of years. Oh, well, we must go to, this opposing army, killed a couple of our men. Who gives a fuck, tell them they owe us some silver. Oh, they raped our princess? Oh, we're going to go burn their town to the ground. Totally different scenarios. Something that doesn't even involve necessarily death or even direct physical harm. If it's directed against the right party, the human race tends to look at it differently. Now, this is not the same in every culture. But I think that the Judeo-Christian idea of penance is useless because the Judeo-Christian idea of value associated with crimes is so absolutely out of whack. They would consider, again, stealing a stick of gum on a biblical basis technically is no different from murdering someone. I think that that's an abomination. I think that that's an absolutely inarticulate moral system dreamed up by idiots. So no, I don't believe in penance. I don't believe in sacrifice. I don't believe in sacrifice as in like animal or child sacrifice any more than I do the concept that a person should sacrifice any part of themselves unless they need to or unless they are disposed to do so for emotional reasons. You know, throw yourself in front of your loved one to save them from getting shot or something. Okay, that's a noble act. I can understand that spur of the moment. But to be compelled to, like, you know, fast or beat yourself over the head or praise some distant external god, say, oh, please, I'm so sorry that I stole that stick of gum 20 years ago. I think it's just a retarded idea, honestly. It doesn't have any place in any authentic and forthright spiritual system. That's about all. Peace out.